You look like a dead man who hasn't figured it out yet. That's what Walter Dennison told Carl Holmgren in June of 1959, studying the steel Quonset hut Carl planned to heat through an Alaska winter. Dennison had survived 28 hard years in the Tanana Valley. He knew exactly what killed Chichacos. 7 months later, when January temperatures hit 52 below zero and the cold snap turned deadly, Dennison fled for Fairbanks, his oil tank empty, his cabin freezing solid. Carl Holmgren stayed. Inside his uninsulated steel box, feeding wood into a contraption built from salvaged barrels, Carl kept his two children alive through the worst cold in 26 years. The sourdough ran. The Chichaco survived. This is how. 52 degrees below zero. Carl Holmgren fed another spruce round into the firebox and watched the flames curl around the bark. The wood hissed and popped as frozen sap met fire. Behind him, his children slept under every blanket they owned. Peter, 6 years old, and Anna, 4, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. The walls of the Quonset hut were coated in frost. Ice crystals had formed where moisture from their breathing met the steel, creating patterns that glittered in the lamplight. The curved ceiling arched above them like the inside of a frozen rib cage. But the water bucket beside the stove hadn't frozen. The kerosene lamp burned steady. And the thermometer Carl had nailed to the center post read 46 degrees. Not warm, but not death. 3 miles east, Walter Dennison was loading his wife into their truck. Dennison had lived in the Tanana Valley for 28 years. He'd survived winters that killed younger men. He'd told Carl back in June that the Quonset would be his coffin. Now Dennison's oil tank sat empty. The delivery truck hadn't made it through the drifted roads. His cabin, a proper log structure with real insulation, had dropped below freezing 6 hours ago. The old sourdough was running for Fairbanks while the Chichaco stayed put. Carl checked the stove again. Two 55-gallon drums stacked vertically, connected by a 6-inch pipe. The lower barrel glowed dull orange where the fire burned hottest. The upper barrel radiated heat he could feel from 10 feet away. Smoke traveled up from the firebox, through the connecting pipe, curled through the upper chamber, and exited the flue at 250 degrees. All that missing heat, 400 degrees worth, that would have escaped up a normal chimney, was staying in the room instead. The neighbors had called it a trash can contraption, a Chichaco death trap, something a greenhorn built because he didn't know any better. 6 months ago, Carl Holmgren had never cut a cord of firewood in his life. He'd never spent a winter north of Seattle. He'd never built anything more complicated than a bookshelf, and everyone in the valley had told him the same thing. You cannot heat a steel box through an Alaska winter, not without money, not without oil, not without resources Carl didn't have. They weren't laughing now. But 6 months earlier, Carl had arrived in the Tanana Valley with $550, 2 children, and no idea what he was walking into. The truck broke down 11 miles from the claim. June 19th, 1959. Carl stood on a dirt road that was more mud than gravel, staring at steam rising from the hood of his 1949 Ford. Peter and Anna sat in the cab, faces pressed against the window, watching their father with the particular worry children develop when they've already lost one parent. The radiator had cracked somewhere in the last 50 miles. Fairbanks was 40 miles behind them. The homestead claim was 11 miles ahead, and Carl had $37 in his pocket until he could find work. He started walking. 3 hours later, a flatbed truck stopped beside him. The driver was a thick man in his 50s, beard down to his chest, 2 fingers missing from his left hand. He studied Carl for a long moment before speaking. "Are you the Chichaco who bought the Dawson claim?" Carl nodded. "Carl Holmgren." Walter Dennison. I'm your neighbor, 3 miles east. Dennison didn't offer his hand. Your truck's 11 miles back with 2 kids in it. Want to tell me why you're walking toward a piece of land with nothing on it instead of walking toward town where you might find help? I need to see what I bought. Dennison made a sound that might have been a laugh. What you bought is 160 acres of spruce and birch, a creek that floods in spring, and permafrost that'll break any plow you put in the ground. Same as every other patch of dirt in this valley. He jerked his thumb toward the truck bed. Get in. We'll fetch your kids first. By evening, the Ford was towed to the claim. Dennison's wife had fed the children, and Carl stood on his land for the first time, watching the sun hover above the horizon at 10 o'clock at night. The Quonset hut sections lay where the freight company had dropped them, curved steel panels, bolts, and ribbing, enough to build a structure 20 feet wide and 48 feet long. Carl had bought the kit at a military surplus auction in Anchorage for $275. The Army had shipped 20,000 of these huts to Alaska during the war. Now they sold them to anyone desperate enough to live in one. Dennison walked the pile of steel, kicking at panels, testing the gauge with his thumbnail. When he finished, he turned to Carl with an expression that mixed pity with disgust. You're putting a family in this? It's what I could afford. Steel conducts cold. You understand what that means? Dennison rapped his knuckles against a panel. The sound rang out across the empty land. Every bit of heat you generate is going to travel through these walls and disappear. It's like trying to warm up a tin can sitting in a snowbank. Carl had known this in theory, but hearing it stated so plainly made his stomach tighten. What would I need to heat it? Oil stove. You'd burn 100 gallons a week, maybe more in January. That's $25, $30 a week just for heat. You have that kind of money? No. Then you'll need wood, 12 cords minimum for a proper cabin. This steel box? Dennison shook his head. 15, maybe 18. You have a chainsaw? No. A crosscut saw? I can buy one. And you know how to use it? Know how to drop a tree so it doesn't kill you? Know the difference between birch and spruce? Between green wood and seasoned? Dennison stepped closer. How much wood have you cut in your life, Holmgren? Carl said nothing. That's what I thought. Dennison looked toward the children, who were chasing each other through the fireweed. You've got 4 months until freeze up. 4 months to build this shelter, cut 15 cords of wood, dig a well, put up food for winter, and figure out how to keep 2 kids alive in a place that wants to kill all 3 of you. A man with experience might manage it. A Chichaco alone? He paused. You'd best find a wife or head back to Seattle before you get those kids frozen. I can't go back. Why not? There's nothing there. My wife died in March. Cancer. I spent everything we had trying to save her. This claim is the only thing I own in the world. For a moment, something shifted in Dennison's face. Then it hardened again. Sentiment won't keep you warm in January. Neither will stubbornness. I've seen plenty of men come up here thinking grit is enough. Most of them quit by Christmas. He turned toward his truck. Some of them don't make it that long. Carl watched him drive away. The sun had dropped closer to the horizon, but still refused to set. His children had stopped running and were looking at him now, waiting for reassurance he wasn't sure he could give. 15 cords of wood. 4 months. No chainsaw, no experience, no money. He did the math in his head. Even if he cut 1 cord every 2 days, which was optimistic for a man who'd never swung an axe professionally, that was only 60 cords in 4 months. But cutting wasn't the only work. He had to assemble the Quonset, build interior walls, dig a well, or find a water source. Hunt, fish, and garden to supplement their food stores. Care for 2 children who needed meals, supervision, and schooling. The numbers didn't work. No matter how he arranged them, the math came out wrong. Conventional heating required resources he didn't have, and there was no way to acquire them in time. Carl looked at the Quonset panels gleaming in the midnight sun. Everyone said steel was a death sentence. Everyone said you couldn't heat it without money. Everyone said a chichaco with 2 kids and no experience was already dead. He just hadn't realized it yet. But as he stood there, running impossible calculations, he remembered something. Korea, winter of '52. A mechanic in Busan who'd heated his repair tent with nothing but salvaged fuel drums. 2 barrels, one on top of the other. The smoke went up into the second barrel before it went out the chimney. 2 bites at the apple, the man had called it. Grab the heat twice before you let it go. Carl had never thought about it since, but now, staring at a problem that had no conventional solution, the memory surfaced like a bubble rising through dark water. It was probably a crazy idea. Probably wouldn't work. Probably just the desperate thinking of a man who'd run out of sane options. But Carl Holmgren was out of sane options, and 4 months from now, the temperature would drop below 0 and stay there for 6 months. He had until then to figure out how to grab the heat twice. The Quonset went up in 3 weeks. Carl worked from 5 in the morning until 11 at night, taking advantage of the endless summer daylight. Peter helped where he could, holding bolts and passing tools. Anna made a game of sorting screws by size. By July 10th, the curved steel shell stood complete, a rib cage of corrugated metal, 960 square feet of space, entirely uninsulated. During the day, the interior reached 90 degrees as sunlight heated the steel. At night, it dropped to 50. Carl could feel the temperature swing through the walls, the metal conducting heat in and out without resistance. Dennison had been right about that much, but Carl had spent those 3 weeks thinking about the mechanic in Busan, about heat rising, about surface area, about the energy wasted in a normal stovepipe. At night, while the children slept, he'd sketch designs on scrap paper. 2 barrels, vertical configuration, connecting pipe-sized to create back pressure without choking the draft. The idea made sense in theory. The lower barrel would be the firebox, that was standard. But instead of the smoke going straight up the chimney, it would travel through a connecting pipe into the upper barrel where it would circulate against more surface area before exiting. The upper barrel would act as a heat exchanger, capturing energy that would otherwise be lost. A single-barrel stove produced about 150,000 BTUs. If Carl could capture even half the waste heat from the exhaust, he might push total output above 200,000, maybe higher. It might be enough, even for steel walls, even for an Alaska winter. On July 15th, Carl drove to Fairbanks for supplies. The trading post on 2nd Avenue sold everything a homesteader needed: tools, food, hardware, and hope at marked-up prices. Carl purchased a cross-cut saw, an axe, files for sharpening, and 50 pounds of flour. He was calculating what remained of his budget when he saw the barrel stove on display. Single 55-gallon drum, door welded on, legs bolted underneath. Price tag, $35. "That'll heat a cabin," the clerk said. "Maybe 800 square feet if you keep it fed." "What about a Quonset? 960 square feet, no insulation?" The clerk laughed. "Brother, you'd need 2 of those running full blast, maybe 3, and you'd still freeze." Carl studied the stove, the door, the damper, the stovepipe collar. How much for just the door assembly? No barrel. Just the door? The clerk scratched his head. "I could sell you the hardware for $12, but you'd need a barrel to put it in." "I'll find my own barrels." 3 days later, Carl stood in the surplus yard at Fort Greely, 200 miles south of Fairbanks. The Army was liquidating supplies, vehicles, equipment, building materials, and hundreds of 55-gallon drums that had once held fuel, oil, and solvents. The drums were free for anyone who'd haul them away. Carl selected 2 heavy-gauge drums, military specification, thicker steel than commercial barrels. These would last 20 years instead of 5. He loaded them into the Ford and drove back north, stopping only to pull an abandoned stovepipe from a collapsed mining shack east of Delta Junction. Total materials cost $12 for the door hardware, $8 for miscellaneous fittings, nothing for the drums and pipe, $20 to build a stove that everyone said couldn't work. Frank Morrow found Carl unloading the drums at his claim. Morrow homesteaded 3 miles south, 8 years in Alaska, practical and experienced, the kind of neighbor who helped without being asked and judged without saying so. He watched Carl roll the drums toward the Quonset. "You building a moonshine still?" "Wood stove, 2-barrel design." Morrow walked a circle around the drums, studying them the way a man studies something he doesn't quite believe. "I've seen barrel stoves. They work fine for a workshop, not for a house. They burn too hot and too fast. You'll run out of wood by February." The second barrel captures waste heat. Carl had practiced this explanation in his head, knowing he'd need to defend the idea. "Smoke circulates through the upper chamber before it exits. I can extract more BTUS from the same wood." "Who told you that?" "Nobody. I figured it out." Morrow's expression shifted. Not anger, something closer to concern. "You figured it out. Based on what?" "I worked motor pool in Korea. You learn how heat moves through metal, how engines waste energy and exhaust, how you can recover some of it if you build the right kind of system." "This isn't a truck engine, Holmgren. This is your family." Morrow's voice dropped. "What happens when your theory doesn't match January? When it's 40 below and your contraption isn't putting out what you calculated?" Carl had asked himself the same question. At 3 in the morning, staring at sketches, he'd imagined his children shivering in a steel box while a failed experiment sat cold in the corner. "If I follow the conventional path," he said, "I can't produce enough wood. I'd need 15 cords. I can maybe cut 8 before freeze-up, probably less, with everything else I have to do." "So you're gambling." "I'm betting that the conventional approach guarantees failure. At least this way I have a chance." Morrow said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Show me the design." They sat in the Quonset, as Carl explained, the connecting pipe, the upper chamber, the heat exchange principle. Morrow listened without interrupting. When Carl finished, the older man rubbed his jaw and stared at the drums. "Might work," he said finally. "Might not. Only way to know is to build it and find out." He stood. "I've got a welder you can borrow, but I want it back by September. I've got repairs that won't wait." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If this thing fails, you and those kids are in serious trouble, and I'll have helped you build the thing that killed you." He paused at the door. "I hope you're right, Holmgren, but I'll be honest, I think you're gambling with lives you don't have the right to risk." He left Carl alone with the drums and the doubt and the knowledge that the gamble was already made. Word spread through the valley faster than Carl expected. By August, everyone within 30 miles knew about the Chichaco's trash can stove. The phrase traveled from homestead to homestead, repeated with varying degrees of mockery and disbelief. Carl heard it at the trading post, at the one-room schoolhouse where Peter had started attending classes, in the looks that neighbors gave him when they passed on the road. But no one spoke to him about it directly until Lyle Carver found him at the hardware counter in Fairbanks. Carver ran the only heating oil delivery service within 60 miles, a thick man in his early 50s, face weathered by decades of Alaska winters, hands permanently stained with petroleum. He controlled the fuel supply for most of the valley, and he priced accordingly. Carl had met him twice before. Both times, Carver had tried to sign him up for a delivery contract. Both times, Carl had refused. Now Carver stood beside him at the counter, watching Carl pay for wire mesh and sand, materials for lining the stove's firebox. The clerk counted out change. Carver didn't move. "I hear you're building some kind of science project," he said. "2 barrels welded together, planning to heat that steel barn with garbage and dreams." Carl pocketed his change. "It's a heat exchanger design. The upper barrel captures." "I know what you think it does." Carver stepped closer. "I've been selling oil in this valley for 9 years. You know what I've never seen? A Chichaco outsmart Winter. But I've seen plenty try. Seen them come up here with their big ideas and their theories about how to do things different. Most of them are gone by spring. Some of them go back where they came from. Some of them go into the ground. Then you've got nothing to worry about." Carver smiled without warmth. "I'm not worried, Holmgren. I'm just reminding you, when that contraption of yours fails mid-January and your kids are shivering in the dark, I'll be the one you call. My emergency rate is 45 cents a gallon, cash on delivery, and if you can't pay—" He shrugged. "Well, I guess your kids can warm themselves with all those big ideas." Carl met his eyes. "I won't need your oil." "Everyone needs my oil eventually. The smart ones plan ahead. The dumb ones pay double." Carver tapped the counter once. "Some of them don't pay at all because they don't make it to spring. Think about that when you're building your trash can contraption." He walked out. The clerk avoided Carl's eyes. The other customers suddenly found their shopping very interesting. Outside, Carl loaded his supplies into the Ford and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Carver's threat wasn't empty. In January, if the stove failed, Carl would have no choice but to buy oil at whatever price Carver named. And if he couldn't pay, the children. That's what made it real. Not his own survival, he'd accepted risk when he came to Alaska. But Peter and Anna hadn't chosen this. They'd trusted their father to keep them alive. And their father was betting everything on 2 salvaged drums, and a theory nobody believed. Carl started the truck and drove home. There was work to do. Construction took 8 days. Carl cut the door opening with a hacksaw and cold chisel, metal shrieking against metal for 4 hours until his arms trembled and his hands bled through his gloves. He welded the cast iron door frame in place using Morrow's equipment, learning the technique through trial and error, burning himself twice before he got the seams clean. The connecting pipe was the critical element. Carl cut a 6-inch hole in the top of the lower barrel and a matching hole in the bottom of the upper barrel, then fabricated a collar from scrap steel to hold the connecting elbow in place. The fit had to be tight enough to prevent smoke leakage, but loose enough to disassemble for cleaning. He worked through a rainstorm that turned the ground to mud. Worked through a day when the mosquitoes were so thick he could barely see. Worked through exhaustion that made his vision blur and his hands shake. Peter brought him water and sandwiches. Anna sat nearby, drawing pictures in the dirt. Sometimes Carl caught them watching him with expressions he couldn't read. Hope and fear mixed together. The look of children who've learned that parents can fail. On September 3rd, he lit the first fire. The kindling caught. Flame spread to the split spruce. Smoke rose through the connecting pipe into the upper barrel. Carl watched the thermometer he'd mounted on the lower barrel's surface. 300 degrees, 400, 500. At 600 degrees, he felt heat radiating from the upper barrel. At 700, the Quonset's interior temperature began to climb. Within an hour, the thermometer read 65 degrees inside. The stove worked. Carl sat on an overturned bucket and watched the flames through the door's air vent. He'd been right about the theory. The upper barrel was capturing exhaust heat, just as he'd calculated. Flue temperature at the chimney exit read 260 degrees, 400 degrees cooler than it would have been with a single barrel design. All that captured energy was radiating into the room instead of escaping into the sky. Peter appeared at his shoulder. "Is it working, Dad?" "It's working." "Does that mean we won't freeze?" Carl pulled his son close. The boy smelled like wood smoke and summer grass. "It means we have a chance, but we're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do." Outside, September sunlight slanted through the birch trees. The first hard frost was 3 weeks away. The first snow, 6 weeks. The first deep cold, 8 weeks at most. The stove worked in September, when outside temperatures hovered at 45 degrees. But September wasn't the test. October wasn't the test. November wasn't the test. January was the test. And every old-timer in the valley was waiting to see what happened when the real cold came. The woodcutting nearly broke him. Carl had estimated 8 cords before freeze-up. By October 1st, he'd managed 6.5, falling short of even his modest goal. His hands were masses of calluses and cracks. He'd lost 15 pounds since June. Some nights he was too tired to eat, falling asleep at the table while the children watched with worried eyes. The crosscut saw demanded a technique he'd had to learn through pain. You couldn't force the blade. You had to let its weight do the work, pulling and pushing in rhythm, letting the teeth bite gradually into the wood. Too much pressure bound the blade, too little wasted energy. Carl's shoulders ached constantly, a deep burn that never quite faded. Peter helped where he could, stacking split wood into cords. Anna carried kindling, but the heavy work fell on Carl alone, felling trees, bucking them into rounds, splitting the rounds with a maul and wedges. 8 to 12 hours a day of labor that seemed to produce results too slowly to matter. October 8th, the cross-cut blade snapped. Carl was halfway through a birch trunk when the saw bound in the kerf. He pulled too hard. Steel shrieked, and the blade came apart in his hands, one end whipping past his face close enough to feel the wind. He sat in the sawdust, staring at the broken tool. Replacement blades cost $9 at the trading post. He had $43 remaining. The round trip to Fairbanks would take 2 days. 2 days not cutting wood, not stacking, not preparing for winter. But without a blade, he couldn't cut at all. Carl made the drive. When he returned on October 10th, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, the first real cold of the season. He found the Quonset at 28 degrees inside, water jug cracked and frozen, frost thick on every wall. The stove had been cold for 2 days. Without constant feeding, the Quonset became a freezer within hours. Whatever margin the double barrel provided, it couldn't overcome the basic physics of uninsulated steel. Heat left the building almost as fast as the stove produced it. Carl lit a fire and watched the temperature slowly climb. 30 degrees, 35, 40. The children huddled near the stove, blankets wrapped around their shoulders. They'd survived 2 days of cold by sleeping in their clothes and eating food that didn't require cooking, but Carl could see the fear in their faces. They'd learned something during those 2 days, something he'd hoped to protect them from. The margin for error was 0. 1 breakdown, 1 delay, 1 failure of any kind, and the cold would take them. He had 7 cords of wood stacked beside the Quonset. At current consumption rates, that might last until late January. But if winter hit hard and early, if temperatures dropped below 40 and stayed there, he'd burn through his supply weeks before spring. Carl needed more wood, but his body was failing. His hands shook when he tried to grip the saw. His vision blurred from exhaustion. He'd pushed himself to the limit, and the limit wasn't enough. November 3rd, Frank Morrow's truck pulled up to the Quonset. Carl was splitting wood, slowly, painfully, each swing of the maul sending shocks up his arms. He didn't stop when Morrow climbed out, didn't turn when footsteps approached. Holmgren. Carl split another round. Morrow. I brought something. Morrow jerked his thumb toward the truck bed. Carl looked. 2 cords of split birch, high-quality wood, properly seasoned, neatly stacked. I can't pay for that. It's not charity. Morrow leaned against the Quonset wall. You helped me repair my well pump in July. Call it even. A well pump repair isn't worth 2 cords. Maybe I want to see if your contraption actually works. Consider it an investment in knowledge. Morrow paused. And maybe I'd rather not watch kids freeze because their father was too proud to take help when he needed it. Carl set down the maul. His arms were trembling. His vision wavered. When was the last time he'd eaten a full meal? Why? He asked. You said yourself I was gambling with their lives. You are. But I've been thinking about what you said, that the conventional approach guarantees failure. You're right. A man in your situation, no money, no equipment, no experience, you were dead either way. At least you tried something different. Morrow shrugged. I still think you're probably going to freeze, but I'd rather be wrong about that than watch it happen knowing I didn't lift a finger. They unloaded the wood together. 2 cords added to 7 made 9. Not enough for a hard winter, but closer. That night, Carl checked his figures again. The stove was performing better than expected. Flue temperatures stayed between 240 and 280 degrees, indicating efficient heat capture. At current consumption rates, 9 cords might stretch into late February, but consumption would rise when the real cold came, and the real cold was coming. November 15th, the radio announced an extended forecast. Temperatures below 30 degrees for the rest of the month, dropping to 40 below by mid-December. Normal winter for interior Alaska, and then the announcer added something else. The almanac was predicting a severe cold snap in January, possibly the worst since 1934. The year Fairbanks averaged 36 below zero for the entire month, the year that killed 5 homesteaders in the Tanana Valley. Carl looked at his woodpile, looked at the double-barrel stove, humming steadily, holding the interior at 52 degrees, looked at his children sleeping peacefully in the warmth the contraption provided. The stove worked. It worked better than anyone had expected. It might get them through a normal winter, but the forecast wasn't calling for a normal winter, and somewhere out in the darkness, the cold was gathering, waiting, patient. The real test was still coming. December came in cold and stayed that way. The thermometer outside the Quonset door read 15 below on December 1st, 20 below on the 10th, 25 below on Christmas Eve. Carl fed the stove around the clock, waking twice each night to add wood, checking the flue temperature each time to make sure the system was running efficiently. The double barrel performed. Inside temperatures held between 45 and 52 degrees, cold enough to see your breath, warm enough to survive. The children adapted. They slept in heavy clothes, did their schoolwork in mittens, learned to keep the water bucket close to the stove so it wouldn't freeze. Wood consumption ran higher than October, but remained manageable. Carl burned through 1.5 cords in December. At that rate, his remaining supply would last into late February, maybe early March, if the weather held. Dennison stopped by on December 20th, ostensibly to borrow a wrench. He stood inside the Quonset for 10 minutes, studying the stove, feeling the heat radiating from the upper barrel, checking the flue temperature with a hand held near the chimney pipe. "Mild December," he said finally. "You've barely been tested. The stove's doing what I designed it to do. And 25 below, that's nothing." Dennison pulled on his gloves. "The cold comes in January. Always does. 40 below for a week, sometimes 2. That's when you'll find out if this contraption is worth the steel it's made from. He left without saying goodbye, but Carl noticed he'd stood closer to the stove than necessary, warming himself, studying the design with something that might have been curiosity beneath the skepticism. 2 days later, Carl saw Lyle Carver at the trading post. The oil man was loading supplies into his truck, extra fuel cans, emergency rations, the provisions of a man preparing for a siege. Heard your trash can is keeping you alive, Carver said. For now. So far. I've got your name on my emergency list. 45 cents a gallon after New Year's. 50 if I have to make a special trip. He smiled. Weather Service is saying January is going to be a bad one. Coldest in years, maybe. You might want to think about putting some money aside. Carl said nothing. He had $63 to his name. Enough for maybe 140 gallons at Carver's emergency rate. 4 or 5 days of heating oil for the Quonset. Not enough to matter. Carver knew that. The smile said so. December 29th. The temperature rose to 10 below. Practically balmy. Carl used the respite to cut deadfall near the Quonset, another half-cord of spruce, dry and ready to burn. The children spent a few hours outside, building snow forts, their laughter carrying across the frozen silence. That night, the radio delivered the news Carl had been dreading: Arctic air mass moving south from the Yukon Territory. Interior Alaska should prepare for extended temperatures of 35 to 50 degrees below zero beginning January 3rd. Duration estimated at 1 to 2 weeks. Residents are advised to check heating systems, stock emergency supplies, and avoid unnecessary travel. Old-timers are comparing this system to January 1934. 1934. Carl had heard the stories. 36 below average for the entire month. 5 homesteaders dead in the Tanana Valley alone. Pipes frozen, livestock killed. Entire families evacuated to Fairbanks because their heating systems couldn't keep up. He checked his wood supply. 7.5 cords remaining. At December's consumption rate, that was 5 months of fuel. But December's consumption rate assumed 25 below, not 50 below. In truly extreme cold, the steel walls would bleed heat 3 times faster. He might burn through a cord every 4 or 5 days. 7.5 cords. 14 to 18 days at crisis consumption. The forecast called for 1 to 2 weeks of extreme cold. It was going to be close. Carl spent New Year's Eve checking every joint in the stove system, tightening connections, cleaning the flue of the creosote buildup that could cause chimney fires. He tested the damper, verified the draft, made sure the connecting pipe between barrels was sealed tight. The stove was as ready as he could make it. On January 2nd, he loaded the firebox with the largest spruce rounds it would hold, logs 10 inches in diameter, dense with stored energy. He banked the coals carefully, adjusting the damper for a long, slow burn. He made sure the children knew how to add wood if he was incapacitated. He filled every container in the Quonset with water, knowing that if the temperature inside dropped below freezing, the pipes would be the least of his problems. Then he waited for the cold to come. It came on January 3rd like a door slamming shut. Carl woke at 5 in the morning to a sound he'd never heard before, a deep groaning crack from somewhere in the forest. Then another, then a third, sharper, like a rifle shot, trees exploding, sap freezing so fast inside the trunks that the wood couldn't contain the pressure. He checked the thermometer outside the door, 41 degrees below zero. The stove was still burning, but the interior temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight. Carl loaded more wood, faster now, bigger pieces, and watched the flames climb. The lower barrel began to glow, dull orange shifting toward red. Heat rose through the connecting pipe into the upper chamber. By 7 o'clock, the interior held at 43 degrees. The stove was running near maximum output. Carl could feel the heat radiating from both barrels, waves of warmth pushing against the relentless cold bleeding through the steel walls. 43 degrees. The children could survive that. It wasn't comfortable. They ate breakfast in their coats, breath fogging above their oatmeal, but it wasn't death. Not yet. January 4th, the temperature dropped to 47 below. Carl fed the stove every 45 minutes, day and night. Sleep became impossible. He dozed in a chair beside the firebox, waking whenever the flames dropped, adding wood with hands that had stopped feeling anything but cold. The radio reported that Carver's oil delivery truck had broken down 15 miles outside Fairbanks. Frozen fuel line. 3 families on his route were now without heat, their tanks empty, no delivery coming. Emergency evacuations were being organized. Carl allowed himself a small, grim satisfaction. Then he added another log and kept working. January 5th brought 52 below zero. The air outside had a quality Carl had never experienced, a crystalline stillness that seemed to absorb sound. When he opened the door to check the thermometer, the cold hit his face like a physical blow. His eyes watered instantly, and the tears froze on his cheeks before he could wipe them away. Inside, the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees despite the stove running full blast. Ice crystals coated the interior walls. The curved ceiling sparkled with frost. Near the walls, the air was so cold that water thrown against the steel would freeze before it hit the floor. But at the center of the Quonset, within 10 feet of the stove, the temperature held. The lower barrel glowed orange-red, surface temperature approaching 800 degrees. The upper barrel radiated steady heat, 450 degrees across its surface. The flue exhaust ran at 240 degrees, every possible BTU extracted before the smoke escaped. The double barrel was doing exactly what Carl had designed it to do, capturing heat twice, pushing output toward 250,000 BTUs, holding the line against cold that would have overwhelmed any conventional stove. Carl checked his wood supply. 6 cords remaining. At current consumption, nearly a third of a cord per day, he had 18 to 20 days of fuel. The forecast called for 10 to 14 days of extreme cold. It was going to be close, but he might make it. Then Anna woke up with a fever. She complained of a sore throat at breakfast on January 6th. By noon, she wouldn't eat. By evening, her forehead burned against Carl's palm, 102 degrees, maybe higher. He had no medical thermometer, no medicine except aspirin and the willowbark tea a trapper had taught him to make. Carl faced an impossible choice. Fairbanks was 40 miles away. The road would be drifted with snow, treacherous in the extreme cold. His truck had no block heater, at 50 below. The engine oil would be thick as molasses, the battery weak, the fuel line prone to freezing. If the truck broke down between the homestead and town, all 3 of them would freeze within hours. But if he stayed and Anna's fever worsened, if this was pneumonia or scarlet fever or something else that needed real medicine, she could die in the Quonset just as easily as on the road. He looked at his daughter, small and pale beneath the blankets, and made the only decision he could. They would stay. He would treat the fever with what he had, and he would pray that it was nothing serious. Carl moved Anna's bed directly beside the stove, close enough that heat radiating from the upper barrel fell across her body like sunlight. He stripped inner bark from willow branches and boiled it into tea, sweetening the bitter liquid with the last of their honey. He kept her hydrated, kept her warm, kept the fever from climbing higher through sheer force of attention. Peter helped without being asked, 6 years old, and he understood that his sister might die, that his father was fighting a battle on 2 fronts, against the cold outside and the sickness within. The boy fetched wood, stoked the fire when Carl dozed, watched over Anna with a solemnity that broke Carl's heart. January 7th, outside, 49 below. Inside, 42 degrees near the stove, below freezing at the walls. Anna's fever held at 102. She took broth. She slept. The crisis hadn't broken, but it hadn't worsened either. The radio reported that the Denisons had evacuated to Fairbanks. Their oil tank had run dry on the 5th. Carver's delivery never arrived. Walter Denison, 28 years in Alaska, the sourdough who had called Carl a dead man, had packed his wife into their truck and fled. 2 other families had evacuated the same day. A third, the Andersons, an elderly couple who refused to leave their homestead, were found by a neighbor on the 9th, both alive but severely hypothermic. Emergency aircraft evacuated them to Fairbanks. Mrs. Anderson lost 2 toes to frostbite. The valley was emptying. Families with oil heat, families with conventional stoves, families who'd done everything right by traditional standards, they were running or they were dying. And Carl Holmgren, the Chichaco with the trash can contraption, sat beside his sick daughter and fed wood into a stove that everyone had said couldn't work. January 8th. The worst night. Anna's fever spiked to 103. Maybe higher, Carl couldn't tell anymore. His hands were too cold to gauge temperature accurately. She was delirious, calling for her mother, speaking to someone who'd been dead for almost 2 years. Her small body burned with heat while the Quonset walls radiated cold. Carl hadn't slept in 3 days. His hands were raw and bleeding from handling frozen firewood. He'd lost track of meals, lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of feeding the stove and checking his daughter's fever. At midnight, he made a decision. If Anna's fever didn't break by dawn, he would risk the drive to Fairbanks. The truck might freeze. They might die on the road. But watching his daughter die in the Quonset, knowing he hadn't tried everything, was worse than any other ending. He told Peter the plan. The boy nodded, face pale, understanding what wasn't being said. Then Carl did something he hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. He prayed. The stove crackled and popped. The wind howled outside, driving snow against the steel walls with a sound like sand against glass. The temperature inside had dropped to 39 degrees, the lowest it had been all winter, despite the stove running hotter than ever. Carl checked the flue temperature. 220 degrees. He was extracting every possible BTU from the exhaust. There was nothing more the system could give. He moved Anna's bed even closer to the stove. Heat poured off the upper barrel, waves of warmth that he could feel on his face from 2 feet away. He positioned her so the radiation fell directly across her body. Then he sat beside her and waited. At 2 a.m, he added the last of the night's wood, 4 large spruce rounds that would burn until dawn. The lower barrel's surface temperature climbed past 800 degrees, hotter than he'd ever run it, hot enough that he worried about the steel warping. The upper barrel glowed with residual heat, 480 degrees, radiating energy into the frozen air. At 3 a.m, Anna stirred. Carl leaned over her, heart pounding. Her eyes opened, clear, focused, not the glassy stare of delirium. "Daddy?" He touched her forehead, still warm, but not burning, not the fierce heat of a fever out of control. "I'm here, sweetheart." "I'm thirsty." He gave her water. She drank. She asked for food. The first time in 3 days she'd wanted to eat. He made oatmeal, and she ate half the bowl before falling asleep again. By dawn, her fever had broken. Not gone, she was still sick, still weak, but the crisis had passed. The fever was coming down on its own. Carl sat in the chair beside her bed and wept. Outside, the thermometer read 44 below. Still brutal, still dangerous. But the worst was over for Anna and for the weather. The radio announced that the cold snap was beginning to ease. Temperatures would rise above 30 below by the 12th, above 20 below by the 15th. He'd made it. They'd made it. The stove had held through the worst cold in 26 years, and his daughter had fought off a fever that could have killed her. Carl checked his wood supply. 4 cords remaining. At reduced consumption rates, that was enough for another month, more than enough. The trash can contraption had saved their lives. Walter Dennison returned to the valley on January 14th. He and his wife had spent 10 days in Fairbanks, staying with relatives, waiting for the cold to break. Their cabin had suffered frozen pipes and some cold damage, but the structure was intact. They'd survived, though not through their own preparation. Dennison drove to Carl's homestead before going home. He pulled up to the Quonset, stepped out of his truck, and stood looking at the steel walls coated in ice crystals, the chimney trailing thin smoke into the gray January sky. Carl met him at the door. "She's alive," Carl said, knowing what Dennison had come to see. "Fever broke 3 days ago. She's still weak, but she's going to be fine." Dennison nodded slowly. "And the stove?" "4 cords left. I'll make it to spring with fuel to spare." Carl stepped aside and Dennison entered the Quonset. The interior was modest, 46 degrees, frost on the walls near the edges, blankets piled on every bed. But the air near the stove was warm, and the children were alive, and that was more than could be said for some families in the valley. Dennison studied the double-barrel configuration for a long time. He put his hand near the upper barrel, feeling the heat. He checked the flue temperature with the back of his fingers, an old sourdough trick. He walked a circle around the stove, examining it from every angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I've been in this country 28 years. I've seen winters that killed men tougher than either of us. I've seen chichacos come up here with big dreams and leave in pine boxes." He paused. "I told you this steel barn would be your coffin. I told you that contraption couldn't work. I said you were a dead man who hadn't figured it out yet." Carl waited. "I was wrong." Dennison met his eyes. "My wife and I ran for town while you stayed here and kept your children alive. I had a proper cabin, proper insulation, 28 years of experience, and I had to flee because I trusted Carver's oil truck to show up when I needed it. You had nothing but 2 salvage barrels and a theory nobody believed, and you made it work." "I got lucky with the fever." "No." Dennison shook his head. "Luck is when things happen by chance. You calculated this. You built something that produced more heat from less fuel, and you did it because you understood that the conventional approach was going to fail." He extended his hand, the one missing 2 fingers. "I've never said this to a chichaco before, but I'm saying it now. You earned your place in this valley. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, you come to me." Carl shook his hand. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Dennison pulled on his gloves and moved toward the door. "One more thing," he said. "Frank Morrow's been talking about that stove of yours, so have Greenleaf and Hutchinson and a few others. They want to know how you build it, the dimensions, the materials, how the heat exchanger works." He paused. "If you're willing to share, there are people who want to learn." Carl thought about the nights of doubt, the sketches drawn at 3 in the morning, the desperate gamble that could have killed his children if he'd calculated wrong. "I'll share everything," he said. "Anyone who wants to build one, I'll show them how." Dennison nodded once and left. By February, 4 double-barrel stoves were under construction in the Tanana Valley. Carl provided the designs freely, hand-drawn plans showing barrel placement, connecting pipe dimensions, damper positioning, floor protection requirements. He visited each homestead, helped with fabrication, shared what he'd learned about draft management and creosote prevention. Tom Greenleaf built the first copy, installed it in his workshop, and reported that he'd cut his wood consumption by 1/3 compared to his old single-barrel setup. Bill Hutchinson converted his cabin's heating system entirely, removing the cast iron stove he'd used for 12 years in favor of Carl's design. The Underwoods built one for their barn, saving 2 calves during a late February cold snap that otherwise would have killed them. Word spread through the Bush Pilot Network, the trading post bulletin boards, the informal channels by which information traveled in rural Alaska. By spring, a dozen families across the interior had heard about the Chichaco's trash can stove. By the following winter, variations of the design were heating workshops and cabins from Fairbanks to the Kenai Peninsula. Frank Morrow stopped by in March, after the worst of the cold had passed. His wife had recovered from the pneumonia she developed during the January freeze. His single-barrel stove had kept them alive, barely, but the experience had shaken him. "I owe you an apology," Morrow said. "I gave you that wood back in November because I thought you were going to die. I wanted to be able to say I tried to help after you were gone. I didn't believe the stove would work. I thought you were gambling your children's lives on something that only made sense on paper." "You weren't wrong to doubt," Carl said. "It was a gamble. It was engineering. You understood something the rest of us missed. That more surface area means more heat extracted. That the exhaust energy is wasted in a conventional setup. That 2 barrels working together can outperform 1 barrel working alone." Morrow shook his head. "My grandfather heated his house in Minnesota with a stove his father built. I've been burning wood for 30 years. And a Chichaco from Seattle figured out something in 6 months that never occurred to me. I was desperate. Desperation makes you creative. Desperation makes most people stupid. You got creative instead." Morrow paused. "I want you to help me build one, for my workshop this spring, and for the cabin next fall. I'll pay you for your time." "You gave me 2 cords of wood when I needed them most. Consider us even." They built the stove together over 3 weekends in April. Morrow learned the technique, the careful welding, the precise pipe sizing, the damper placement that controlled airflow without choking the draft. By the time they finished, he understood the design well enough to teach others. Lyle Carver never apologized, never acknowledged that his delivery failure had nearly killed 3 families, never admitted that Carl's unconventional approach had succeeded where his oil-dependent system had failed. But Carl noticed that Carver's prices dropped that spring. The emergency surcharge disappeared. The threats about 45 cents a gallon were never mentioned again. Something had shifted in the valley's economics. When homesteaders realized they could heat their buildings with salvaged materials and free wood, the oil man's monopoly weakened. Not broken, plenty of people still needed heating oil, still relied on Carver's deliveries, but weakened enough that the balance of power had changed. Carl saw Carver at the trading post in May. The oil man passed without speaking, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. But just before he reached the door, he stopped. "One winter doesn't prove anything," he said without turning around. "Wait until the next real cold. These contraptions will fail eventually." Carl said nothing. Carver left. But they both knew the truth. The contraption hadn't failed. The oil truck had. Carl Holmgren proved up his homestead claim in 1963. By then, he'd built a proper log cabin with full insulation. Birch logs he'd cut himself, chinked with moss and clay, warm enough that the double-barrel stove could maintain 70 degrees even in the coldest January. He moved the original stove to his workshop, where it heated the space he used for repairs and carpentry. He remarried in 1968. Ellen was a school teacher from Fairbanks, patient and practical, good with children who'd lost their mother too young. Peter and Anna accepted her slowly, then completely. The family grew roots in the Tanana Valley that held for decades. Peter left for Anchorage after high school, became an engineer, designed heating systems for commercial buildings. He credited his father with teaching him that the conventional approach wasn't always the right approach, that sometimes you had to capture the heat twice. Anna moved to Seattle, became a nurse, married a man who'd never seen 40 below and couldn't quite believe her childhood stories. but she kept a small barrel stove in her garage, built from plans her father had given her. "Just in case," she said. "You never know when you'll need to grab the heat twice." Carl never bought heating oil. 50 winters in Alaska, and every one of them heated with wood he cut himself. He upgraded stoves as technology improved. The SOTZ Corporation started manufacturing commercial barrel stove kits in the early 70s, and Carl bought one of the first double-barrel models, comparing it to his hand-built original. The commercial version was cleaner, better sealed, but the core principle was identical. 2 barrels, 1 connecting pipe, capture the heat before it escapes. The SOTZ Corporation sold millions of units before going out of business in 1988. Other manufacturers took over: Vogelsang, U.S. Stove Company, smaller outfits that recognized the demand for economical wood heating. Today, barrel stove kits remain one of the most affordable heating solutions available, used in workshops and hunting cabins across North America. Most users don't know where the design came from, don't know that the double-barrel configuration was first tested in a Quonset hut during the coldest January in 26 years, with a sick child beside the fire and a Chichaco father doing the math between life and death. The innovation succeeded so thoroughly that it disappeared. It became common knowledge, standard practice, something everyone knows works without remembering why. That's the fate of ideas that actually solve problems. They become invisible through success. Carl Holmgren died in 2003 at 75. His obituary in the Fairbanks Daily News Miner mentioned his Korean War service, his decades on the homestead, his children and grandchildren. It did not mention the winter of 1960, or the stove that saved his family, or the nights he'd spent feeding wood into a contraption everyone said couldn't work. But the people who knew him remembered. The workshop on his property still stands. Inside, rusted now but intact, sits the original double-barrel stove, the one Carl built from military surplus drums and salvaged pipe, the one that held the line through 52 below, while his neighbors fled, and his daughter fought fever, and the entire valley waited to see if the Chichaco would survive. The connecting pipe has corroded, the damper no longer moves smoothly. The door hinges have seized with decades of disuse. But if you knew where to look, if you cleaned out the ash and checked the flue and loaded the firebox with dry spruce, you could light a fire in it today. In January 1960, Carl Holmgren sat in a steel box that everyone said would be his coffin, feeding wood into a stove that everyone said couldn't work, keeping his children alive through the coldest night of his life. The skeptics had called it a trash can contraption. They were right about the materials: salvaged drums, scrap pipe, military surplus discards that cost less than $20 total. They were wrong about everything else. The Alaska homestead was never about defying nature. It was about understanding nature well enough to work with it instead of against it. Carl didn't beat the cold that winter. He just found a way to take more from each piece of wood before the heat escaped into the darkness. 2 barrels instead of 1. Capture the energy twice before letting it go. Grab the heat that everyone else wastes. It wasn't genius. It wasn't luck. It was desperation turned into calculation. Calculation turned into action. Action tested by the worst that Alaska could deliver. The temperature the January night dropped to 52 below zero. Inside the Quonset, beside the stove that everyone said couldn't work, the temperature held at 46 degrees. Not warm, but not death. A Chichaco and his children alive in a steel box waiting for dawn. The cold is patient. It waits for mistakes, for failures, for the moment when preparation falls short and desperation takes over. But sometimes desperation builds something the cold can't beat. 2 barrels welded together, one insight about heat transfer. 60 years later, the design still works. And somewhere in the Tanana Valley, In a workshop that used to be the place where a widowed father built furniture to sell and repairs to trade, that original stove still stands. If you lit a fire in it tomorrow, it would still grab the heat twice.